One day you're on top of the industry, next day you're in video game obscurity. These are in my view the biggest falls from video game grace by notable companies and people. Let's get on with it. Number 5. John Romero and Ironstorm. The reason? Daigatana. John Romero had attained a true rock star status in the industry by the mid-1990s. He was one of the founders of id Software, whose Wolfenstein 3D and Doom games ushered in the FPS genre. However, after the problem-filled production of Quake, Romero had had enough and went on to start a new company with fellow Doom developer Tom Hall, called Ironstorm. Romero wanted the new company to take off on a bang and began developing his next big FPS title. What came out of this endeavor was an infamous ad campaign and a game that was mediocre at best. While Ironstorm didn't topple overnight, the only game to achieve even mildly positive feedback from them was Tom Hall's Anachronox. But Daigatana permanently damaged the company's image, finances, and, most importantly, Romero's reputation in the industry. Romero since remained as a low-profile contributor to several other companies and apologized for the infamous ad campaign years later, noting that it did the most damage since it actually hurt his reputation with his fans. Number 4. Commodore Computers. The reason? The decline of the Amiga line. Commodore was one of the leading computer companies of the late 70s and early 80s. The company tapped into a true gold mine with the Commodore 64, which became the gaming computer of its era. Commodore then continued this success with their Amiga line of computers in the late 80s. These inexpensive gaming computers put any DOS and Apple computer to shame with their graphic and sound capabilities and relatively affordable price tag. Unfortunately, Commodore proved to be less savvy in the business side of things. Not only did Commodore hemorrhage money by releasing computers at a loss, their attempts at releasing a cheaper model computer ended up with a product no one wanted. The last nail on the coffin was the failure to release the CD32 home console in the US, due to a block placed on Commodore by a federal judge over unpaid patents. Within 4 years, Commodore had gone from being the king of PC gaming to complete bankruptcy. Number 3. Sierra Online. The reason? The Sendent scandal. You may be hard-pressed to believe it now, but back in the mid-1990s, Sierra was not only one of the biggest video game developers, but also one of the biggest publishers, with several important, or soon-to-be important, companies under its belt. The company launched into fame in the mid-80s by introducing graphic adventure games to the world, and a decade later they were putting out games of various sorts. At the height of their success, company founders Ken and Roberta Williams retired and sold the company off to CUC International, which was later merged into the company called Sendent. What was supposed to be a deal to secure Sierra's fortunes had dire consequences. Jump to the early 2000s, Sierra had barely any companies under its belt, its game development was completely obliterated, and the company was sold off to Vivendi Universal. What happened? Sendent was found to be guilty of money laundering, and Sierra found its assets seized by the FBI until the end of their investigation. What followed were layoffs and companies switching publishers until Sierra was just a shadow of its former self. The company has recently resurfaced under Activision ownership, but it seems unlikely they'll ever reach the same heights again. Number 2. Sega. The reason? Saturn. Few companies have gone as high as fast as Sega and come crashing down just as quickly. Despite becoming Japan's first domestic console manufacturer, Sega only started to attain a major presence in the industry with their 16-bit Mega Drive/Genesis console. Sega was the market leader for most of the early 1990s, giving Nintendo a run for their money. But then when Sega was supposed to make the leap to the 32-bit systems, they fumbled the ball big time. The Sega Saturn was released months ahead of its original planned release date, completely without the knowledge of developers making games for the system, and a price tag which ensured that Sony would take the market lead with the PlayStation's release during the holiday season that same year. After fumbling the release, Sega kept making one bad business decision after another until in 1998, the Saturn was officially canned. Sega may have had a chance to bounce back with the Dreamcast console, but supply shortages and the release of the PlayStation 2 2 years later made sure Sega would never be able to dig itself out of the hole that Saturn dug for the company. Now Sega exists as a game developer and distributor only, and the company's rep in the industry is really anything but glamorous. Number 1. Atari. The reason? Video game crash of 1983 and 84. Sure, Sega may have risen and fallen at the same rate as a shot-down jet plane, but Atari had been the industry leader for nearly a decade. After making video games cool and hip with Pong, the Atari 2600 became the best-selling console up to that point. Atari was at the height of their power in the early 1980s, with even their closest competitor, the Mattel Intellivision system, only ever selling about 1/10 of the amount of systems Atari did. However, Atari's fall directly contributed to the video game industry-wide crash. Store shelves were already overbloated with unsold video games, since there wasn't any real regulation for game releasing. And apart from wasting money on rather ludicrous things like the real money prizes for its Sword Quest series, Atari launched an unsuccessful follow-up to the 2600 and sank millions into the movie tie-in rights to release a Raiders of the Lost Ark and an E.T. video game. By the end of the fiscal year in 1984, Atari was completely in the red, and the console branch was sold off to Time Warner, and its other departments went their separate ways. The console division would return a few more times to haunt everyone, and Atari even clung on to life later as a game publisher, hitting bankruptcy yet again in 2013 and re-emerging as an internet gambling service. That's all from me for now. I'm TheHande, and see you on the next one.